Hello again, YouTube. Um, I wanted to follow up on Theo Warner's video about the death penalty. And I think there are misunderstandings in the comments that need to be addressed. And it's about ethics and politics for me. And in some way, this is going to be an explication of what I think the difference between those two discourses are, and how it affects the arguments that people are giving about the death penalty. And this is also sort of an innate critique of other systems of ethics that I've seen recently proposed by people who identify with the new atheist movement, if that's a viable term. Don't get hung up on that term because I know it's sort of crappy, but it's this question starts in classical philosophy, right? The question that the discourse of ethics emerges from is the question, how should I live? Right. The question of politics is affirmed by, or is built on the question, how should we live together? Right. Another way to say that would be that the central, as Rousseau puts it, the key word in politics is association, right? So ethics then is very self-oriented in a certain way. I would define ethics, or the way that I've taken to defining ethics is that ethics is it's how the self creates itself as a self in the face of an other, right? So in other words, it's the way that we create ourselves. It's the way in which we write the story of our lives. It's the aesthetics of the self, you might say. And I think that, therefore, when I say something like murder is wrong, or murder is immoral, what I'm saying is that there is a part of me that I label as the conscience, right? There's some piece of me that reacts with horror to the idea of murder. So, first of all, this is a subjective claim. I'd affirm it's a subjective claim, and I think it's only meaningful as a subjective claim to a certain degree. I don't see a problem with it being subjective. Now, that thing that I refer to as a conscience, that part of myself, is shaped basically intersubjectively, right? I learn things from the society within which I grow up. I develop myself within that society. I learn about the world through various interactions with various people at all sorts of different levels of my life. And that's how, more or less, every part of me is shaped. Or it's a maybe not every part, but that's integral to how I'm shaped as a person, and that includes my conscience. So there is an intersubjectivity to this conversation of ethics. Also, if I do something, it will not like that action. If I were to kill somebody, for instance, that action doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? So my conscience isn't the only thing that is brought to bear on that. Other people viewing it um, bring their consciences to bear on that action as well. And it's, in some way, the discourse is about working that out between different people within an intersubjective setting. But when I say murder is wrong, I'm referring to an internal experience of the concept of murder, an internal reaction to the concept of murder. Socrates put it. He had a daemon within him. That would. It's a nice metaphor for the idea of a conscience. So that conversation is what I call ethics, right? The question of politics, how should we live together? That conversation is the conversation of which would be a conversation about things like state policy, right? Should the death penalty be illegal, right? Should it be legal or illegal? This is not a moral question to me. This is a political question, right? Should we tolerate it within society, right? Now, these two discourses are interrelated, right? And also, when you start to bring to bear like quantifiable terms, right? If you kill this serial killer, then he won't go on to kill X more people, and etc. Like that for me is political reasoning, right? That doesn't mean it's bad. That doesn't mean that it's not justified. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that I am reasoning in such a way that it doesn't take into account that thing that I call a conscience. And I'm reasoning in such a way that I'm talking about like the betterment of the society that we live in. I'm talking about how should we live rather than how should I live. And this isn't an idiosyncratic use of the terms ethics and politics. This is in the traditional conception of those terms. I think it's a problem actually that we've sort of lost this conception of these terms. But in separating these two spheres of discourse, certain possibilities emerge. Something can be immoral and still be legal, right? Without contradiction. So in some way, this is my argument against the pro-life claim, right? And that is that you can, or it's an argument of a certain strand of pro-life argument, I'll put it that way. You can be morally disgusted by it, right? That is, you can, for whatever reasons you want. In some way I get that. I don't think that that's immoral, but I can accept that someone else thinks that abortion is immoral. But in order to say, therefore it should be illegal, you have steps to take. You have all your work still ahead of you to demonstrate that it should be illegal, right? And those are pragmatic questions, right? You have to take this a priori conscience-driven feeling, and you have to communicate it in pragmatic terms. Now, So you can have something that is immoral and still legal without contradiction. You can have something that is moral but prohibited without contradiction as well. This is the category of, for instance, civil disobedience would fall into this category. It is illegal by definition, and yet moral by definition, right? And there is no contradiction. The force of civil disobedience comes from its illegality, and the moral, that's how that moral force is demonstrated, right? This is why we can have the category of an unjust law, right? Because law and morality are in I'd say a dialectical relationship with one another. They're not mutually inclusive or mutually exclusive, but they function dialectically. Changes in our law will change how we conceive of the ethics of various things. Changes in our ethical disposition will affect how we conceive of the politics of various things. I don't think that, and I think that's clear, right? So about the death penalty, the statement, the death penalty is immoral, is an appeal to the conscience. And I don't think that disqualifies it, right? And I think you can have a conversation about it too. I don't think that means it's somehow debased by saying that claim is rooted in my subjectivity. The claim the death penalty should be legal is a different claim. And the way I see it, the people within the comments section, or various people within the comments section of Theo's video, are arguing about whether or not the death penalty should be legal, which I think is a very different question. You know, I can imagine scenarios where the death penalty, where you can give a solid political argument for the necessity of the death penalty in a certain context or a certain case. But I don't think that we should ever feel good about it, right? And I think the contradiction between, and I'm using the word contradiction slightly different here, not in I'm using the word contradiction in an existential sense rather than in a formal sense, whereas before I used it in a formal sense. So pardon the equivocation. But the contradiction between the political claim, the death penalty is necessary in these sets of circumstances, versus the death penalty is immoral, or I find the death penalty to be immoral. If I affirm both of those, which I don't do, but I think that there are people who would do this, that should cause anxiety, right? It should cause not cognitive dissonance, because that's a technical term, but it causes dread, right, to use the existential term, angst. And what's disturbing to me is the lack of anxiety about it. You know, people who make the political argument for the death penalty without addressing the ethics of the death penalty, the experience of conscience within the conversation of the death penalty. People who make the political argument deny the subjective experience of the conscience and then show no anxiety about it. This is the most disturbing position of all. You know what I mean? This is really, really deeply problematic for me. You know, and Sam Harris argues, I think in The End of Faith, about torture, right? If only we had some pill that would cause somebody outwardly to appear as if they're just sleeping. But internally, they're experiencing some horror, unparalleled horror, right? This way we could trick our conscience into being, sedated. We could trick our reaction of empathy. If only we could do this, this would be a great world. And this is part of his, or not. It wouldn't be a great world, but this is a part of his. He wants to trick the conscience, kind of, in order to do these things. I think that this gesture of turning off the conscience is dangerous. I think it's problematic. I don't think it's solid grounds when talking about the ethics of the political conversation. And I mean, just really, like, we really need to reconceive of our discourse when, like, one of the big, we as atheists need to rethink our discourse when the man who writes that only we need to turn off our conscience in order to be able to torture people and be okay with it, when that man writes a book that called The Moral Landscape, and we take it seriously, right? And that's sort of a side conversation to have, but it's sort of interrelated into the question of the effectiveness of policy as related to a goal, and the reaction of the conscience to various pieces of the world. Now, there's another thing too. Some people will say that my position is morally nihilistic. I really don't think that this is a sustainable position. I just reject that entirely. Or some people will say this is relativist, right? The moment somebody says that this is relativist, that's just a curse word. It's not an actual position, right? This is just it's the equivalent of saying you're stupid. There's nothing substantive about that. So saying that this is a morally relativist position is actually not a substantive critique, I want to say. Preempting people who might say that. Morally nihilistic, I reject that entirely. I think it's the opposite. This is, in some way, my position is very close to Nietzsche's countermove against nihilism, or it shares a certain sympathy with it. And I think that we really, as atheists, need to reevaluate a discourse. The other thing too is that, so what function do ethical writings play, right? Why write a treatise on morality or some such thing, right? Why read a treatise on morality if it's a subjective experience? And my answer to that is that I think that we consciously and constantly shape our conscience through meditation on these questions. There were various things that I find myself shocked. Not shocked, that's not the right word. I take moral objection to, in my sense of the term, that I wouldn't have previously in my life. And the reason why is because I have read and researched various aspects of the of what morality is, how it functions, the various ways to argue these points. That's all a process of internalization by which I shape my conscience. And that's an intersubjective experience too, by the way, reading a book or something. That's intersubjectivity. So yeah, that's the purpose of that. And just, again, trying to address various criticisms as they might, the ones that I can think of as they might manifest. So that's my opinion. There's another point too. Apologize for keep thinking of new things. This video is getting pretty long. I think it's really dangerous to conflate ethics and morality. I think that that's a deeply problematic thing. To present political arguments as ethical arguments and to present ethical arguments as political arguments. Either of those moves is dangerous to me. Because not separating these two implies that politics is ethics, right? And an ethical politics, or a system in which those have collapsed, is a totalitarian politics. In a system where those have collapsed, like completely and totally, is a totalitarian politics, because it can imply, and I don't want to make this statement too strongly because I think it would be risky, but it's not too far to go from that collapse to something like the claim that therefore the law is necessarily ethical, right? Therefore the claims of the ruler are necessarily ethical. You know, this is the genesis, or this is the mindset that the totalitarian world wants you to be in, right? So that's my criticism of collapsing those two things together, and why I think that's dangerous. So that's my opinion. Again, a very long video. I apologize for that. But please comment and subscribe, and a link to Theo's video will be in the description. Thank you. Have a good day.